Hello everybody and a warm welcome at Hamburger Bahnhof National Gallery of Contemporary Art for our lecture with Jeff Wall today. Dear Jeff, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to come to Berlin and to speak today about your work. It has been a great wish from all of us here to invite you to Berlin. Your work is an important part of the collection of the National Gallery. Today, we are looking forward to a special format of In Conversation, as it won't be a conversation, but a lecture with many greetings. We are very delighted to host today's event in cooperation with Deutsche Bank and American Academy in Berlin. Deutsche Bank is a long-standing partner of our In Conversation series here at Hamburger Bahnhof. Thank you very much for that. We do have 2 permanent loans of Jeff Wall from you in our collection. And the American Academy in Berlin invited Jeff Wall as a Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitor. And needless to say that the American Academy is one of the most important transatlantic institutions because it plays an important role when it comes to scientific, cultural, and political exchange between US and Europe. And what can be more important in these days? So, we are very pleased to be here on site with our partners as a place for intellectual exchange, dialogue, visibility, and to support the important role of art in our society. We thank you all beyond measure for making this evening possible. Thank you so much, Deutsche Bank with Britta Färber and Sarah Bernshausen, for your generously support of Deutsche Bank, the series. Thank you so much, American Academy in Berlin with Nana Ballmann, the whole board of the American Academy in Berlin, and Nadine Rager. It has really been a wonderful and pleasure working with you, and we are really looking forward to many more cooperations. Thank you, the audience, for coming. Thank you, Jeff Wall. And I will now hand over the microphone to Britta Färber, followed by Nana Ballmann and Jeff Wall. We will end the lecture with a moderated Q&A by our director, Till Fellrath. We wish you an inspiring evening.
Thank you, Matilda. Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to all of you for coming here today. That's really overwhelming, incredible. And I can see so many artists in the audience, which is also a very special occasion for me. Thank you. And what I would like to say is, and also, of course, most of all, thank you to Jeff Wall for coming over. For us, and I will come to the American Academy also later. It's a very special format for us as well, but we have a close connection to the American Academy as well, as we are supporting one fellowship for musical composition here in Berlin, which is a very acclaimed fellowship. Yes, and this series, as I just learned a minute ago, is not in conversation today, but it's a talk, not a lecture. And I mean, it's so important that we have these moments where we can listen to artists, especially in the world of today, that we have these possibilities to change our perspective, to get to know different perspectives on the world. And this is what we are doing with this series, and this is why it is so important for us, and I hope for everyone here as well, especially in the world of today, which, I mean, we all know that it has become more divided than ever. Jeff Wall, we have been working with him back in 2007 jointly with the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. And as Mathilde was mentioning, we are working on this permanent loan for the Hamburger Bahnhof Nationalgalerie der Gegenwart. And we will be very happy to have these two works here in the collection, and I hope you will all look forward to seeing them one day. Jeff Wall's work is even more important today, as he has been for many years occupied with topics which are truly important, like talking about marginalized groups in society, talking about violence, structural violence, about everyday racism. But this is something I guess we will learn much more about in a minute. And I would like to say, and seeing all the artists here, and I have to admit, I just ordered a cap with this signage. It says, "Listen to the artists." And I think this is what is important today, listen to the artists. And I'm happy to hand over now to Nana. Thank you.
So, good evening from me as well, and thank you to Mathilda, to Sam and Till for hosting us here tonight, and for your wonderful remarks, Mathilda and Britta. So I'm Nana Ballmann. I'm the Senior Advisor for the Arts Program of the American Academy in Berlin, and on behalf of the American Academy and our President, Daniel Benjamin, who is here tonight as well, I would also like to welcome you all to Jeff Wall's presentation. And as has been mentioned before, Jeff Wall is our Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitor this year. Again, I would really like to thank Till Fellrath, Sam Badoui, and Mathilda Legema for hosting us here tonight at Hamburger Bahnhof, and of course, the Deutsche Bank with Britta Färber and Sarah Bernshausen for their generous support of this conversation series. Especially, of course, for making tonight's program possible. We are very glad that the three of us could join forces and bring Jeff to Berlin here tonight. I would really like to thank the team at Hamburger Bahnhof for their dedication and their help in putting this event together. Before introducing Jeff, I'd like to say a few words about the Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitorship, which was mentioned before, and which helped us bring Jeff here. Jeff is the Academy's, if I counted right, 9th such visitor, following artists like Carrie James Marshall, Arthur Jafa, Julie Meritu, Haley Mellon, and most recently Doug Aitken. The Max Beckmann Distinguished Visitorship was established in 2017 with the help of many generous supporters, especially artists from Germany and the United States, who donated works to a charity auction hosted by Villa Griesebach. The proceeds of this collective effort are part of the funds that now allow us to bring an artist of exceptional international stature to Berlin each year, and in this sense, I would really like to thank the donors for their support, and some of them are even here tonight, so thank you very much. And now it is my great honor and pleasure to briefly say a few words about Jeff Wall, though Jeff hardly needs any introduction. He's an artist of truly legendary stature, who has not only profoundly shaped our understanding of photography as an art form, its compositional and narrative potential, as well as its philosophical dimensions, but also transformed the way photography relates to other art forms, from painting to literature to cinema. His photographs are all distinctive, elaborately composed pictorial inventions that invite the same kind of contemplative attention as a painting. He masterfully combines exploration of subject matter and narrative with an extraordinary sense of composition and formal precision. Because of their large scale, akin to history paintings, his photographs have been referred to as tableaux. Some are painstakingly staged, rehearsed, and orchestrated, like scenes from a film, a concept he calls cinematographic photography. Others resemble images made by journalists or documentary photographers, yet are still made by means of various forms of artifice, an approach he describes as near documentary direction. To most people, He's perhaps best known for his mesmerizing transparencies mounted in light boxes, a medium he first borrowed from the advertising industry and introduced to art in the late 1970s. However, his oeuvre encompasses a wide range of photographic media, including black and white photographs, gelatin silver prints since 1996, and since 2000, inkjet prints. His subjects range from almost fortuitous everyday situations to dramatic scenarios, to cityscapes, landscapes, still lifes, and architectural studies, as well as works that directly reference art historical and literary precedents, such as paintings by Delacroix or Manet or Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Over the past more than 45 years, Wall, a trained art historian, has written extensively about art, about his own work and that of other artists, about art history and theory. Beyond his own writing, he has been the subject of over 50 monographs and exhibition catalogs. And as I learned yesterday, you can actually acquire a very small but very beautiful publication from the 1990s at the Reina Sofia's online store for just 60 cents. His exhibitions are also far too numerous to list. He has had well over 100 solo shows across the world. And at this very moment, you can see solo presentations of his work in Turin, Toronto, and Bologna, where he opened a new exhibition just this past weekend. He's also the recipient of many awards, including the Hasselblad Award, the Roswitha Hamburger Prize, and the Order of his native Canada. His groundbreaking work and his intellectual rigor have educated and influenced generations of photographers and artists after him. And I'm now very excited for all of you to discover the depths and riches of his practice, his thinking, and his references. And please, without further ado, welcome Jeff Wall.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just say thanks to everybody at once. Thanks for coming. I'm going to refer to my notes a little tonight, so if I'm looking down, you'll know why. About 40 years ago, I think it would be about 40 years ago, photography did develop or went through a development that led it into a different kind of space. There are a lot of reasons for that development. There's a lot of reasons for that change, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight. I'm going to treat the transformation of photography that Nana more or less outlined as a sort of a accomplished historical fact, and not wonder about why it happened or whether it was a good thing. These things are still being discussed, obviously. Instead, I'm going to just try and tell you about the conversations I have had with myself about what I've tried to do over the years. There is no conversation with the second person here tonight because I felt like it would be maybe more interesting for you to hear a report on the conversations I've had alone during my work for quite some time. One of the major transformations of photography in that 80s period was that it moved into a space that previously had only been occupied by another art form, and that was painting. Painting had taught the world to see, the art of painting and the painters had taught the world to see itself in ways that we all know, and I'm not going to try and describe, but photography had no place, or even no ambition to be in that place or in that domain for quite some time. But by the end of the 70s or the middle of the 70s, I think there was an energy, or there were energies inside the photographic practice that needed to go somewhere else. Photography needed to become different than it had been up to that time. It had to become something that was, photography had to found out, I believe, photography discovered, or photographers discovered, that they had the chance or the opportunity or the need to occupy that space that was exclusively that of painting. Photography or photographers discovered that the characteristics that painting had invented and owned for centuries were to some degree available to us, those of us who wanted it, let's put it that way. And so, what was it in painting that we needed? What was it that painting had to offer us? The French use the term tableau for this kind of picture. I show you Velasquez's Las Meninas in Thomas Struth's great photograph of it, because it really is the exemplar of what the so-called tableau is. I'm not going to say anything more about it except everything that painting asked, everything that the gods of painting asked to have done, Velasquez pretty much did in this painting, so it stands on its own. What is this thing called the tableau? It's an object. It's emphatically an object. It's an object that faces us vertically, usually on a wall, and reiterates our own verticality. It reiterates our position in front of it in ways that photographs that were published in photographs that were made available in publication could never do, because we can handle them like we handle any object. One cannot handle a tableau. One feels one shouldn't handle a tableau. So it's emphatically physical. It's also emphatically visual. It's an emphatic rendering of something, whatever the subject happens to be. But the emphatic nature of it is not just the emphatic nature of what is being shown. In this case, the court of Philip IV in Spain. It's showing itself. It shows us emphatically its own process of showing itself. So it has a kind of a doubly emphatic nature. We're talking about figurative painting here for the moment and leave aside non-objective painting, although I'll come back to it later. It also reiterates or copies the world in a way that resembles, often very strongly and surprisingly, the way the world looks when we're not looking at pictures. That's the figurative dimension of painting. And it does that, when it does that properly, when it does it well, it almost seems as if it's looking at us as much as we're looking at it. And I think that paintings then have what we could call an autonomy in relation to us. They seem like an entity on their own. They seem as if they see us as much as we see them. Their autonomy is part of the charm, let's put it that way, of what paintings can be and have been. And that autonomy is something that I think has made people fascinated with these images since they've been in existence, because they seem autonomous to the point where we can't own them. I know people own paintings, they become property of people, but even the people who own them often have the feeling that they don't own them, that there's an autonomy that the art form has created because of its physical nature, because of the way it has rendered the world and the way it has taught us how to see. We can never own it. It has a freedom to it, an autonomy that I don't think photographs had earlier. And that's not to say anything critical about photography before the 1970s. That's not what I'm about. I'm not interested in criticizing the previous regime, shall we call it, of photography. But it wasn't interested in that, or it had not become interested in that for any number of reasons. But that autonomy and that intense replication of vision is something that created what can we call it? A kind of an energy that inspired some artists who wanted to be photographers into this field. That replication, that autonomy, all of these things are achieved by acts of composition. All artists are composers. All art is composition. Everything we do is composition. And as such, paintings had the amazingly durable function of being decorative, of enhancing and making more lively the rooms that would have been dull without them. Sometimes the decorative aspect of painting is considered one of its lesser virtues, but I don't think so. What I'm telling you is what I think about what I do. I'm not trying to create any normative statements for anybody else. I'm talking only about what I do. All of these qualities seem to be available somehow at that point. I felt that all of these things that I had appreciated since childhood in painting were somehow available to me in a kind of new state. So I show you these two images just because I feel that this exhibition I made about 10 years ago had a very pronounced decorative quality, which I enjoyed very much. All the qualities that painting had, freedom of scale, the things I just mentioned, were available, and I think I felt could even be intensified, at least to some degree, by being, in a way, realized or re-realized as photographs. I'll show you a picture I made in 1982. I think that photography provided one of the maybe few things that photography provided, aside from all of the things I mentioned, which are taken over from painting in an almost direct way, was an intensification of the presence of occurrences, the depiction of occurrences. Because even the most realistic painting is still, in a way, has a detachment from the direct recording of an occurrence, which photography, of course, could provide. So I think there was an increased intensity of capture of occurrences that photography could provide in this framework that had been sort of detached from painting. I think it was possible to detach all those qualities from the art of painting. And I know that at some point people have criticized me for imitating painting. But I don't think that I ever imitated painting. I think that I have learned things from painting and realized in the process of admiring them over many, many years that they had an independent capacity, that they could be, in a way, detached from painting and no longer be considered painting. The detachment sort of reminds me of a trick that you can see sometimes that maybe magicians do, where they have a table set with glassware and plates and silverware and a tablecloth, and then they take a hold of the tablecloth and they make a quick movement like that, and the tablecloth whips out from the table, and all the tables and all the dishes and cups are never moved. In a way, that detachment is something like that. It's something that was whisked away out from the world of the domain of painting and put somewhere else. Of course, the gesture was that one, but of course there never was any tablecloth. All of these things I felt could be legitimately used without in any way imitating any effect of painting, whilst doing the other things I mentioned to you. One major element that meant a lot to me, and I think has meant a lot to other people, was the freedom of scale that one learned from the other art form. Let's stop saying painting, we'll just call it the other for the moment. Freedom of scale, the pictures in the other can be large, small, whatever. There's a complete and total freedom of the painter to realize the image at the scale they want. But at the same time, because of that freedom, that other art form also showed us that there's one scale that is different from all the others, and that is what I call universal scale. Sometimes it's called life scale. That is, it's the effect, the illusion, if you like, of the things depicted on the surface or apparently behind the surface that appear to us at the same size as they would do if we turned our head and looked at the room in which we were standing. Life scale. I call it universal scale because I think that the universe, as far as we know it, might be all in one scale. It might be really one scale. It's probably expanding a little, but let's assume it's in one scale. It's more interesting to use the term universal scale because this suggests that it would be like this even if there was no life. So it has an objectivity that no other scale has. Everything is either an enlargement or a reduction from that scale. There's something objective about that which has a kind of, and always did have for me, a kind of magic, as if a different frequency was affected, or maybe the image molecule attained or lost a particular particle. Only at this scale does this effect happen. That doesn't make that scale more important, better, or anything like that. It just makes it special because it is the one objective moment in the scale dimension. So, for example, Mimic is made exactly in life scale. The foot of the walking man is precisely the size that it would be in the real world if there was, it's precisely the size it would be in the real world. Therefore, at that surface, that front surface, everything appears an exact duplicate of the world. And that duplication, that sense of duplication that all made images have, has that effect of arresting the real and making it seem, almost more alive than life itself. Paintings, images sometimes seem to have more life in them than life does because of their arrestedness, their stillness. So life scale is a touchstone I've always used, and it means a lot to me. And a lot of my pictures have been made in life scale. When I say intensification of capture, I think this beautiful painting by Gustav Caillebotte is a good example. It's a very realistic painting, shall we say, and it is in life scale or very near. It's very similar to the picture I made, but the level of capture is different, and the different level of capture isn't a qualitative judgment. It's just a distinction that I make because photography is capable of doing that. I'm not going to talk about this picture because I got a little off track already, and I don't want to talk about it. I'll go on. But if we go back to Mimic, my next point was that life scale doesn't mean big picture. In the 80s and 90s, one of the critical remarks was that we were just making big photographs, as if that was a virtue in itself. I've always made my pictures as small as I could make them, given what I want to do with them. So interest in the magic, if you want to call that, of life scale, obliges the picture to be larger when the subject requires it. But this picture is this big, but it's in life scale. It's in one-to-one scale. So that has nothing to do, life scale has nothing to do with the size of the picture directly. More recent picture, mother of pearl, a little girl examining some mother of pearl coins that in her house, I suppose, is also in life scale. And the way you can tell when you see the pictures at the corner of the table is just a little smaller than it would be if you touched it, because it's just that little bit behind the picture plane. Working with this sort of tableau form imposes technical issues on anybody, because this plane, I was going to walk over and touch it, but I fall off the stage, so I won't. That plane is real in a way that that plane is real in a way different from photographs that are meant to be printed smaller, like Garo Winogrand's street photograph, which I show you because it deals with the eye, but I could have chosen any one of 100,000 other photographs. These pictures are not made to be printed at anywhere near life scale. If they would be, we would have the problem of what size we would print the woman's head. The journalistic photograph and the cinematic image, and we'll get to that, don't have that sense, that scalar intensity. Only the tableau form, the tableau form imposes it by its nature. This picture is called In the Legion. It was made recently. I'll show you it because I've been working with this same scale for the last 45 years, on and off. The picture is determined, the scale of the picture, the size of the picture is determined by the size of this chair, which is set just back of that same plane. So the enlargement of the picture is determined by the actualities of actual size. This kind of picture making imposes certain restrictions or obligations or technical things on the artist. I won't go into detail about that right now. Another outcome of this life scale situation is what I would call open scale. Open scale is meaning that it can be the size that it needs to be in some distinction from the life scale criterion. I'll just show you this as another aspect of a kind of technical freedom that photography obtained. This was made in the 1980s and then remade in the 2000s. It's called an eviction. It shows a family being evicted from their house. And I'll leave it there for the moment. The size of the picture is determined freely by the fact that in order to understand the subject, you need to understand the reactions of the people in it, because the picture is about people. And at below a certain size, this information can't be apprehended very clearly. So that the size of the picture is determined by the nature of what's in it. So some pictures have to be very large because of that, but at the same time, as I said, they're made as small as I can make them. This is Men Waiting. It was made in 2006. Again, it's in principle the same picture and the same problem. The behavior of the people in it and their response to the world has to be seen physically. So the tableau. The tableau is, been something I've identified with for a long time, as I said. And a lot of the people who've, talked about my work have considered that the tableau for me means this kind of painting, because I did this picture, 1979, which was a response to Manet's Bar at the Folies Bergère. And of course, I was involved in this kind of painting, and why would I not be? It's some of the most instructive painting ever made. But this is also a tableau in the same sense. And this is also, and so is this. So is that. And that. And this. This is Lawrence Weiner in the 60s. Instead of making a painting, he extracted part of the surface of the wall on which a painting might hang in order to make what you might call an anti-painting. So I think it's very important to realize that when we talk about the influence of painting on photography, we're not talking about 19th century French masterpieces and stuff like that, even though they play a role. We're talking about the entire dimension of what painting is and has been, and that includes anti-painting. It includes the opposition to painting. It includes the attempt to negate painting. All of those energies were part of the interest in painting that emerged in the 80s. It was not ever an interest in 19th century genre pictures in order to transpose them into photographic genre pictures. That was never part of the program, let's put it that way. The program for my part, the program was inspired or animated by that turbulence inside painting that goes back, quite quite some time. I don't think that anti-art, anti-painting can be registered photographically very well, but there are always traces of it. I feel sometimes in my pictures, I see traces of it in my interest in things that are difficult to see in the field of vision. I don't want to make too strong a point about it, but I'll give you one example. This is a picture called Night, which I made quite a while ago. I forget now, 20-something years ago. And it shows some people, see them in the corner at night, sleeping outside. It's a picture of a type I've made quite a few of. And it's hard to see. It's a very dark picture. And although I never really intended it to be to make any statement about being hard to see, I think that that aspect of parts of my work have to do also with response to the discord. I think it's the discord inside of all of the arts. I don't think that by being interested in painting and the tableau, one is returning to tradition. That's something else that's been sort of mentioned. I don't think that, I'm not interested in tradition. I'm interested in the art that I love, and I can learn something from it. I don't really care when it was made. But at the same time, to be more objective, painting has never been a peaceful art form. It's always been full of evolutions and developments and changes and so on. And it's that energy that I think was captured, or at least I would like to have captured in photographic form. Sometimes you feel like that you've been exiled from an art form by circumstance. And I was a painter when I was a child and a young person, and many things turned me away from it and toward photography, which I can't go into right now. But I like the idea that there's a sort of exile relation, an exile energy involved in that, some sort of banishment that maybe is self-imposed and, creates itself an inner energy that might have something to do with it. So that's enough to be said about the tableau, but it is certainly one of the building blocks of what I would consider the new photography or the developments of photography. And I'm speaking first of all for myself, as I said, but it probably, at least in some objective sense, applies to other people as well. The other great source for me, was the cinema. And like everybody, I grew up going to the movies. And I'm not very interested in the cinema, I have to say, and I don't really even like movies much. I don't dislike them, and when they're really well done, then they become works of art, like a painting is or a poem, and then I like them. But otherwise, I don't really care for them. But what I really like is the photography that's done in making films. I think the photography that was done in making films is some of the most inventive, daring, adventurous, complicated, technically proficient, etc. photography that's been done in our time. I'll show you a couple of examples, but again, there could be thousands, or at least hundreds. This is a still from Roberto Rossellini's film that was, I believe, made here in 1948, Germany, Year Zero, photographed by Robert Juillard. I think the photographers who made these films are important, and we always talk about the director, but it's the photographer who made the images, so I mentioned the director. Photography of this film is akin to documentary photography, which is what Rossellini wanted. But the cinema doesn't have a photographic style. There is no canonical photographic style in the cinema. This is Buñuel, photographed by Néstor Almendros, Los Olvidados, one of his earliest great films, 1951, I think it is. Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant by Fassbinder, photographed by Michael Ballhaus, 1973, I think it is. And more recently, this is The White Ribbon, Michael Haneke's film, photographed by Christian Berger, 2009. Often people ask me to tell them how I made my pictures. What did I do to make my pictures? What is this cinematography you talk about? What is it that you do? I don't like answering those questions because I like to have my little secrets, and I like the fact that my studio is a place that people don't get to go to, and that I don't have to tell everybody what I did. But what is cinematography? In this case, what did they do to make this image, which is an image that appeared for 1/24th of a second in the film? So it plays a minor role in a sense, but it had to be made. What did they do? Berger and Haneke and however other many people were involved. You know, they first of all must have gotten secure access to this room. That's the first thing they probably had to do. Where? So is this a room in a house? Is the house in a town? Is the room on a soundstage somewhere? Did they have to build the room? Could they rent it? We don't know necessarily, but we know they had to solve that problem. They had to get the room, place to put the camera. So, next thing, my guess is, I haven't studied this, but my guess is, if it was me and I had the room, I probably would have tried to figure out whether I could light that room with that chandelier or whether I needed some other lights to hide them somewhere. Because if you look at the picture, it doesn't look like there are any other lights in the room, but there might be. So we would have the space, and we would have a lamp, a light source. So we have to do those two things. We have to get a room or a place, and we have to light that place. What next? Well, maybe we don't have to belabor that except for one thing. The white ribbon is apparently tells a story from 1914 or 13 or something, just at the beginning of the First War. So this is a thing that cinema does that all the arts actually do, and cinema does. Photography wasn't that interested in doing it, but the cinema did it, which is the things that are happening in the picture seem to have happened about 100 years before the picture was taken, because the film was made in 2009, and the events seem to be happening in 1914. So that's the cinematic time travel effect, where we realize that the two calendar dates don't align. The only time the moment of image capture aligns is with the journalistic snapshot or your phone photo, when the image that's made at that moment coincides with the moment in which it was made. But almost every other creative element, every other creative activity, the two dates don't align. Even if they don't align by a small amount, they don't align. And that misalignment is a space in which things happen. Misalignment of dates is a space in which things happen. So we know that the rest of his work, their work, was to convince us, down to the very last detail, that this event we're witnessing really could have happened to look just like this if it happened in 1914 and we were there. That's the willing suspension of disbelief effect in the cinema. Sometimes people talk about my pictures as if they were obsessively planned down to the last detail, as if that was a hang-up. I have some sort of hang-up, like a control freak kind of hang-up. But I wonder, in the case of this picture, where would be the second last detail, the one, not the last detail? The picture is completed to its final detail, down to probably what kind of paint was on the doors, if in fact they ever had to paint the doors, such that it captured the light properly. That would have been the way that light was captured by the paint of that era, and so on and so on. These kind of efforts are obviously part of this, completely part of the cinema, and so now you know how I made all my pictures. For example, a ventriloquist at a birthday party in October 1947, which was made in 1990, so it's the same problem. So if you want to know how I made my pictures, I made them in the cinematographic way, which was essentially doing whatever I had to do to make the picture. That is what cinematography essentially boils down to. It boils down to doing what you have to do, but if you want to think of the elements, there are only two: preparation and collaboration. Those are the only things that sums up the entirety of what so-called cinematography is. I don't want to comment on the details, but I show it to you. But there's also cinematography as photography is infinitely varied. As I said, there's no privileged way of photographing or preparing. And so, of course, films are made in any number of styles. This is a shot from Pasolini's film Accattone, which was made in the early 60s, one of his first films, maybe his first film, maybe his best film, in fact. And the cinematography here is much, much more simple. First of all, it seems to be being made in real time, being made in the time that Pasolini is living in, and his performers are living in. So it's very simply made. I'll show you 4 shots. And these 4 shots follow each other. It's very awkward to reach back here, but someone is addressing someone else. So you can see how simple, technically even rudimentary, this sequence of shots is. What I like about it, what it shows me and showed me is that the cinematography is not something necessarily anything complicated. It can be complicated, or it can be very, very simple. It can be done very, very quickly and very easily and very cheaply. There are no preferred approaches. There are no methods. There's no better way of doing anything. Everything is possible. The range of possibilities is relatively infinite, and they're all determined by what it is you're trying to do. This magnificent close-up is the only one of the 3 that could not actually be considered for enlargement and presentation on a wall, because if you look at the 3 previous shots, and I'll show them to you again. You'll notice that the camera is always far enough back that there's a space in front of the main objects that could plausibly stand as that front plane of that the tableau needs, this invisible front plane which one doesn't tend to cross over, doesn't tend to cross in front of. The camera is always placed somewhat set back far enough that any one of these 3 images could be feasibly enlarged to life scale and maybe be a very successful tableau picture, maybe. I say maybe because filmmakers don't make tableaus, and the cinema is not a pictorial art. But occasionally, these things happen. The final one obviously is in a different category, although I suppose it could be printed at life scale, let's say, if that's what you wanted, and it would make a great picture. It is a great picture, and Pasolini is peculiar. His film is sort of peculiar in that it does make for a lot of interesting stills that could be transformed into something more physical. The one last thing I want to say about the 2 last things I want to say about the cinema is that this is all very realistic. It's photographed almost as if it were documentary, and I use the term near documentary for some of my pictures that have this ambition to resemble snapshot photography or newsreel photography. But inside of this reportage style of Pasolini's film is painting, because his close-up, and this is not the only time he referred to this famous Dead Christ of Mantegna, is inspired directly by Italian painting. So the art forms are constantly informing each other back and forth and changing their shapes. The one last thing I'll say about cinematography is that about the cinema, is that cinema images, projected images, have no scale. That's why they can never really be visual art or pictorial art. I use that term a lot. It's an old-fashioned term, visual art. Now people consider art to be conceptual art, I guess. But there's a thing called visual art, which is the art that has to do with seeing and what things look like and so on. And the two aren't separate. But nevertheless, I use this old-fashioned term because my work is about seeing and about eyesight. And the tableau form has the physicality I mentioned, and therefore it has a very strict sense of scale. Cinema doesn't have that. Everybody goes to the movies and looks at film images that are 40 or 50 feet wide and don't think about it, because it doesn't matter. That aspect of cinema was also not really thought about by film people very much, because they were quite happy to project their films in cinemas and make their movies. Nothing wrong with that. But they weren't that interested in the projection problem and the scale problem itself. It was only in the anti-cinema of the 70s and in experimental film of that period, beginning in that period, where people began to think about this problem of the lack of scale, lack of a scalar nature of the cinematic image, or the cinematic image. I'll jump ahead. This is a performance by Fabio Mauri at the 1975 Biennale in Venice, where he invited Pier Paolo Pasolini, and I'm not really, it's only accidental I'm talking about Pasolini repeatedly. It just happens to be, they're good examples of what I'm talking about, but I could have talked about someone else. But in any case, he invited Pasolini himself to come to the Biennale and sit in his chair while he projected his film about the film of the Gospel according to which saint? I forget now. St. Matthew, right? The Gospel according to St. Matthew, thanks, on his white shirt. And Fabio Mauri was one of those artists of the 70s who, unlike filmmakers themselves, noticed something to do with this distinction between what artists do, what filmmakers do, what cinema is and what cinematography is, and so on. And it's also the anti-cinema, just like I said about painting. My interest in cinematography isn't just in the cinema, it's also in the anti-cinema, because we photographers cannot make cinema. We're not filmmakers. The tablecloth pulling act applies exactly the same to our relation, or my relation, to the cinema. There are certain things that could be detached from it, as I've said, and made use of it otherwise. But that also includes all the things that people were dissatisfied about in those art forms. In the last 20 plus years or so, some people I probably listened to, were talking about the fact that there was a resumption of tradition. I know I mentioned this earlier. The tradition that's being resumed is the tradition and the anti-tradition, and I think that if there's any relation that I have to the older tradition, it's back through the anti-tradition. It's a reversed relationship. Let me just show you, go back a bit. I wanted to show you this picture I made in 1996. It's called Passerby, and I see it as akin in method, if you like, in approach, in technique, to the kind of shots that Pasolini was making in his Acatone. I'm not trying to copy Acatone, but the ethos or the technical attitude is, I think, for me, quite interestingly and strongly related. And so, because I love those pictures, because I love the way those films look when they're still, they've had an influence on how I work. I would say that I have many, many influences, but that kind of thing is one of the strong ones. Okay, so we've detached elements from painting, we've detached elements from cinema, and we are working with them in what I would think of as a new, for me anyway, it was a new, very free space. Very free, meaning because cinematography has no canon of technique, no canon of result, no canon of style. Great films can be made in any style. From Walt Disney films to Pasolini films to whatever, they can be great in any manner. So that openness resembles the openness of all the arts, more than it resembled the openness or lack of openness of photography itself. And I always wanted that openness or that freedom for myself for obvious reasons, because the richness of the traditions and the richness of the art forms is the foundation upon which all that freedom is based. I realized that in all the confusion with the what's it here, I forgot to set my timer. So now I don't know where I am. I'm going to finish with one last, I think, very important thing. And I'll be as quick as I can because it's probably about 49 minutes already. One of the other main things that I learned from being interested in cinematography was that every image contains writing. There's a writing inside of every image. In the cinema or in the theater, for example, there's a scenario with a play. I've always detested the term staged photography because it suggests the theater, the stage. And I hope I've made it clear already, that's not what I do. I don't do that. If anything, it's a hybrid of the other things I was talking about. But at the same time, there is writing inside an image, and that writing is something that I've discovered or thought about more and more in the last few decades. I should say that, just to preface my remarks, is that my attitude towards any literary content in art is sort of very strongly shaped by the kind of modernism, the modernist ideas that I grew up with in the 50s and 60s, that were most perfectly expressed by Clement Greenberg, who's a writer that probably you know, and you probably know how controversial a writer he is. But he was one of the people who emphasized very strongly the distinction to be made between anything literary, which he considered a feature of figurative art, anything literary, and anything visual. And of course, the pushing of this question, the pressing of the issue, was his way of verbalizing the revolutionary sense, the revolutionary feeling that we had with abstract art, non-objective art, when it first appeared. You know, abstract art taught us to see paintings differently. And nobody who has imbibed the ethos of what abstract art meant sees paintings the way people would have seen them beforehand. So, despite being very much sympathetic to that distinction, or because I'm sympathetic to that distinction, I paid a lot of attention to the presence of writing inside images. There's, various relations. I'll show you a couple quickly. Various relations that matter. I'm going to show you a couple of very canonical images, not because I think that these things are only achieved in paintings by people like Rembrandt, but because they're so established that they're easy to understand. Rembrandt made the painting of the Return of the Prodigal Son in 1660 something, and he did it in relation to a specific passage from the Gospel according to St. Luke, the parable of the prodigal son. I show you the text not because I expect you to read it, but just to make it evident that painting was done very specifically in relation to a known text. Of course, for hundreds of years, most paintings were done in relation to known texts, like illustrations of the Bible and so on. If you study the painting carefully, you can see how many changes Rembrandt made in the text, and that difference is part of the writing, what I would call part of the writing process. So this is an obvious and fundamental relationship: the image illustrating a known text, the text known to all. Then there are paintings later that only appear to be illustrating a known text, the text known to everybody. They only seem to be. Manet's Olympia is a good example. It seems to be as intricate a relationship between two figures, three if you include the cat, but two figures, as between the prodigal son and his father. It seems to have that same charge of intricacy and meaning, but there's no text. It's an appearance. There's a text implied. I would say the writing form is to imply or assume or imagine that there's a text. Of course, there isn't one. there's what I would call the reduced text, or maybe the generic text, which is this painting by Cézanne. It has really no title, but it's been titled Still Life with Apples and Biscuits. I think the term still life has no meaning. It really just is the name of the genre. For some reason, the world has called these things still lifes, or nature morte in French. I don't know what the title is in German, but it's probably just as inaccurate. In any case, all the title does is tell you what you're looking at, just names what you're looking at, apples, biscuits, and so on. So that I would consider just a generic title. There's the relationship between a photograph and its caption, which comes from photojournalism. This is Walker Evans from his book American Photographs. And these are the captions that he printed not beside the images, but at the end of the book, separate from the images. And Evans, as you probably know, was an aspiring writer. He became a photographer when he found out that he wasn't as good a writer as Flaubert, and thought that was what he had to do. So that means, but Evans was a very good writer, and if you've read his articles in Fortune that he wrote for many years, he was a very good writer, and his captions are perfectly written. So the relation between a photograph and its caption is also literary practice, and the relationship between a picture and its title. This is a structure of the relationship between a picture and its title. Then there's, of course, untitled. The untitled picture, which is an important feature of what we're talking about, because this is, again, the anti-title. It's the anti-element coming into the phenomenon and reshaping it and making it different. It's also fascinating that, in fact, this picture is called Untitled Number 73. So what it means is that Rothko, who wouldn't title his pictures, was still writing. He's telling you that there's 73 more of these already in existence, and that means something. I'm not going to try and tell you what it means, but he obviously believed it meant something. I mean, it probably meant there's so many of them, you need to pay attention to these things. But whatever it meant, he wrote it. And there's one more, I think, relevant titling and writing aspect, which of course comes again from the same sort of anti-tradition, Ankawara, who painted the day, he made a painting of the date on which he made the painting. Not only did he do that, but in all his paintings, all his paintings come in a box, and the box contains a newspaper from one place or another of the front page of that day's newspaper. So the relationship between the date and so on is pretty obvious, and sort of was one of those conceptual art things. What's interesting about all these different writing relationships is none of them are binding, and they all tend to fuse into each other. At least for me, they became different ways of approaching image making. And it seemed like they all sort of mutate, or can mutate into each other, and become informed by each other. So real text disappears into your personal speaking, and so on. So just to end, I'll show you a very few pictures, because I think we really should stop in a minute, wherein I've treated this problem differently. Of course, I have done pictures that are just like Rembrandt's, or almost just like Rembrandt's. I mean, in terms of their relation to writing, where I've made a picture based on another picture, or another entity. This is The Thinker, made in 1986, and it was a response to Albrecht Dürer's phantom monument to the defeat of the peasantry in the 1600s. It's probably most of you probably know this, pretty famous. The mourning peasant in mourning at the top of this column made up of implements of farm labor and so on, with a gigantic sword in his back, the betrayed. this ignited something for me, and I felt that I could find a relationship to it, and therefore to all the discourse, let's say, that that is implicated. I won't go into any more detail about that, just to say that this is what I would say is the closest to using a known text that I've used. After Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison is more than obvious in this relationship, so not much to be said about it. I'm just showing it as an example of ways in which writing appears. I'm going to go by these because these are just an example of one type, and I think we're out of time, sort of. We're getting to be out of time, so I want to just show you a couple of other things quickly, because these are fundamentally the same thing. After Hokusai. Somebody did ask me about why, or did I care that there was no Mount Fuji in my picture? No, I took it as a serious question, which is, are you making an homage? I'm going to talk about it for a minute then. Are you making an homage to Hokusai? Yes. What does that mean? I don't really know. But the image was compelling, so therefore I did it. The fact that there's no Fuji in my picture, to me, measures, or at least is one of the ways in which one can measure the distance between me and Hokusai. There needed to be no, and there should be no Fuji in my picture. I'll go by this one. Let's see. I'm going to go past these because they're obvious, and I feel like I shouldn't take up too much time, but I want to say one last thing. And it's better said with another image. Let's pick this one. It's quite new. It's called Fallen Rider. All these forms of writing, for me, circulate in sort of an imaginary sort of spherical space. I guess you would think of it. I think of it as a spherical space, kind of space I would be having a conversation with myself in. And the sphere isn't stable, and it moves. And inside that sphere, things occur to me, and they occur to me for any reason. Something I witnessed, because many of the pictures I have done, and some of them I've showed you, have originated for something I really saw. I witnessed myself. I've said many times, I begin by not photographing. And not photographing is a photographic act. It opens up a different dimension of how to work. But it also, that opening was made available by the things I've been talking about, by this free space that this sort of hybrid approach opened up. It's made it possible for me to respond to anything that captures my attention in a particular way. And by particular, I mean strong enough to make me feel like it discloses the possibility of making a picture that I never dreamed I would want to make. So, for example, a friend of mine 30 plus years ago told me about having witnessed this event and thought it might interest me, but it didn't, and I forgot about it. And many, many years later, it came back to me for no explainable reason, that it was a subject that I could do something with. So then I made the picture. That can stand for any number of what I consider starting points, where one starts. So let me just finish this by trying to explain one last thing, which is what I mean by writing in the image, at least what I mean by writing in the image, not what everyone means. Every picture I've done has started with something that wasn't pictorial. Something I saw, something I read, etc. Those aren't pictures. They weren't set off by other pictures, or if they were, it was only very occasionally. Set off by something non-pictorial that had to be verbalized. In order to know it, to recognize it, I had to verbalize it, like mimicking the Asian eye, mimesis of the Asian eye, or in this case, fallen rider. By the way, the titles of my pictures are written in this spirit. So that's verbalized, and I consider that my writing. As soon as I have said to myself, or I've used words, even if they're only unspoken, I've written, it's writing. And that means I have written. In order to begin, I have written. And then the next thing that has to occur is that I have to engage in pictorial construction. And in the ways we've been talking about, I have to engage in making a picture, which has nothing to do with writing, as Greenberg would have argued. Picture making is not writing. It has to do with taking a new relation to writing. I see that the practical or plastic work of picture making as a process of erasing that original writing. It erases it. And the work is no longer writing, the work is erasing. And the erasure itself, the act of erasure, it takes place in the act of making things, like in the white ribbon, you know, getting the room, getting the light, doing all that stuff, doing all that work. That's plastic making. Those people are making things the way a sculptor makes, or so on. It's a plastic act of making. Those things erase the verbalization. So the picture emerges from a new relation to writing, which is a kind of anti-relation in a way that I've been talking about. So that happens, and when the picture comes into existence, that writing has been erased. And it's not there anymore. It's the picture that's there. It's the viewer who rewrites what has been erased. And I think one of the great enjoyments of looking at pictures is your own personal rewriting and re-narrating to yourself any narrative or written element that I would have had to deal with. And we know that your, or the viewer's, writing can never be the same as mine. We'll, you know, even if we were I was going to say two monkeys with two typewriters, but I guess you could say two AI programs running parallel for a million years, we would never write the same thing again. Well, that's probably not true anymore. But you get my point, that you can never write what I wrote. And therefore, the picture, the fascination with the picture, the autonomy of the picture, all the things we've been talking about comes together in that process. So, I didn't want to have a conversation with anybody tonight because I thought it would be more interesting to pretend I was talking to myself, as I always do, wondering about what I'm going to do next, why, and which direction I might go. Last comment. All of the writing forms, the known source, the implied source, the generic source, the journalistic source, the anti-source, they all are present simultaneously in the process. There's no hierarchy of these things. That's part of the freedom inside of the art form. So the freedom that I think that I have is built upon the artistic freedoms that were already in existence for hundreds and hundreds of years in all the art forms. And I think all artists, if they believe in artistic freedom, and I think it's one of those values that everybody believes in, says they believe in, if they believe in artistic freedom, then they really are free, but their freedom is shaped by the processes, the artistic processes that have gone into it. So I'm going to stop there. I think that's long enough. I think that's the gist of what I wanted to tell you, that these three domains, painting, cinematography, and writing, mutate constantly in the process of what I'm trying to do. And I feel that mutation is inherent in the pictorial tradition that goes back all these centuries, and it is inherent in the fascination that people feel in front of the images we've been talking about. So, enough from me. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you so much for all these wonderful insights into your thought process and all these really incredible art historical references, and you're really very, very inspirational remarks this evening, and really makes me personally also rethink about your work in a very, very different way altogether. And I wanted to just follow up on a few points that you were mentioning. One thing is the physicality of your works and the scales. So you were mentioning scale in relation to the viewers and how you perceive them. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about quantity. So while you were giving your lecture, probably in Berlin only, more pictures were taken than in an entire year around the world, let's say 100 years ago. And 100 years ago, you actually needed to either buy books or go to a library or go to a museum to see paintings or have an idea of a painting or a picture of a painting. And you started your lecture also with this image of Thomas Struth, of people looking at a painting in a museum. And now this is so accelerated. And what do you think it does to viewers? Or how do you now interpret or consume or relate to an image as a viewer when you're constantly bombarded and constantly involved yourself in taking pictures all the time?
Oh, you see? Is this on? Is it on? All right, good. Are you asking how do I, or how do people?
About people. What is your view on people? How do they relate to your work? Or are you consciously thinking about this as you are creating your works now?
The physicality I was talking about, I think, is essential. Pictures, let's just call them pictures for the moment. You know what I'm saying now. They're meant to be seen in real life. They're meant to be experienced directly. Everything else is a reproduction. My pictures are made to be seen as they are. They're the size I make them for the reasons I said, and so on. But they're all about being seen directly. And my experience, and I'm sure yours and many other people's, has been most intense by seeing the works in themselves, not reproductions of them. People talk about how they've grown up seeing only reproductions of famous artworks and all that, and how their relationship has been shaped by that. I grew up looking at reproductions of famous artworks too, because I grew up in Vancouver in the 1950s, where there was almost no artworks to be seen except in reproduction. But all that did for me was make me want to see the real things even more. So I have virtually no interest in reproduction. I have only interest in making what I'm making in the way I'm making it. And as I've already said, and I won't repeat it, that physicality contains an enormous cultural, intellectual, emotional, personal charge that people respond to, also really very somatically. It's a somatic relationship, a body relationship that you have to an image. So the acceleration of images on screens and in reproduction are socially important, but I don't have any interesting thoughts about it because they don't really enter my world very much. I don't make my work to be reproduced. I make it, as I've said. The conditions for other people are really just something I could speculate on. I think that there are probably still millions of people who deeply appreciate the actuality of works of art. And sometimes I want to not really listen to the commentators who suggest our world is being so transformed. It may be, I may be wrong, but for me the enjoyment, and I think, our experience of art is a certain kind of intense enjoyment, and it can only come from the thing itself. I think that enjoyment is still, of major importance.
Thank you. I think we can see that also by people going to museums in large numbers and wanting to see objects and artworks really with their own eyes and experiencing the actual impact that they create. And I think in some of your works, you strongly were talking about occurrences and certain seemingly fleeting moments, perhaps, and then there are a lot of sub-narratives, and many of them, have clear resonance of what perhaps we're living today, or what happened here, let's say in the 1930s, for example, or continuously. So there are so many references that you can find in these works. And are you conscious about certain questions that you keep coming back to in your work, or is it maybe just an occurrence or a certain thing that you see perhaps that you feel you want to capture, and then you realize maybe that there are so many connections or so many actualities that you can connect with?
It's mostly accidental for me. That is, as I said, to me, what happens to me is something probably unexpected ignites a little energy somewhere, and that energy discloses. The only thing it really ever discloses to me is my next picture. Therefore, all the subjects I've treated, whether they're of suffering people, well-off people, happy people, etc., those are secondary matters, and they were not the thing that made me make the picture. What made me make the picture, for example, well, it's hard to explain that. It's hard to explain, but the point is, certain situations disclose the presence of an image that I can make that I didn't know I wanted to make until that happened. Call it inspiration. That has really nothing direct to do with what's going on in it. So I don't make any claims about having any particular views about the occasions or the occurrences I make. I make pictures of. Like in the picture of the man making the eye gesture, which is one that contains a lot of social energy, I feel I treated the three characters the same. I didn't take sides. I showed them. And I think that's what the camera does. And I feel it's far, far more productive for me to imitate the camera and not imitate myself. Because I have my own views about this and that, like everybody does, but I don't think they're very interesting, and they don't even interest me. I don't interest myself. I'm not interested in myself. I'm interested in picture making, and I know that by being interested in me, I will make worse pictures than I would if I wasn't interested in me. So the events themselves, let's assume it's a real event like the person falling from a horse, for example. The events themselves contain something meaningful. I like to think that what attracts me is and I guess I could characterize it this way, the fusion at this circumstance of something very now, like something that happened to me or directly now, and something very archaic that has been happening forever, like people falling, like people in conflict, people moving from place to place, people sitting on the ground, whatever it is that's in the picture, these things always happen. And I think that fusion of the archaic and the immediate, which of course, Baudelaire defined in his essay, The Painting of Modern Life, that's what modern art was, the fusion of the eternal and the transitory. I get that, and I know that people think I'm the painter of modern life for that reason. That's not really the point. The point is he was right, that what he said was aesthetically valid, that there's something important about things that occur fleetingly that have kept occurring, and they're always occurring. And I think that that is a sort of an abiding interest of mine. But that's all it is. I don't make any claims for having any social interests in my work, even though it's there. They're not really my views.
Before we open up to the public, to our audience, there's one more question I wanted to ask you. We at Hamburger Bahnhof, we set up a photo lab. People can make pinhole cameras. We have school workshops for analog photography to also slow down, this act of taking a picture, becoming conscious of what you frame and what you communicate and how do you compose and what is the thing that you actually want to say. At the same time, I think you see technologies increasingly being able to fake realities or to invented realities, and it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish when you look at social media, newspapers, or anywhere else, what is really true? Where do you find truth? What is a trustful resource in 2 years and 5 years for anyone that wants to learn about whatever they want to learn about. And the same would apply perhaps to journalists as well, trying to do research on current occurrences. And so what I wanted to ask you, how much do you see can work carry truth? Can your works carry truth? And can photography or can images still claim, you made this wonderful analogy from painting to photography and becoming perhaps more acute or more present in a certain sense, or more precise about a particular occurrence. Is that going to be true in the future? And how do we deal with this? Where's the truth?
One idea is to ignore social media. That would be one solution. That's an easy one. Photography takes place between a camera and something that is outside the camera. That's photography. Whether the receiving surface is a digital plate or a piece of film, whatever, photography takes place in an encounter in the physical world between something that's not the camera and the camera. So everything else is not photography. It may be photo processing or some other thing, but it's not photography. Anyone who wants to practice photography practices photography because that's the relationship they like between the camera and what's outside it. All these other programs are photo processing programs that can never create a new image. They can only recombine images. I'm not really interested in it. I think probably it will lead to some interesting art forms made by artists who like to tap on a mouse pad instead of doing other things. And that's cool because there are no rules and art can come from anywhere. So I don't have any strong feelings about it. To me, it's on one level artistically another medium that might be used, but it won't be photography. What it is, whatever it is, it'll be a synthetic image that we'll give some name to, but it's not photography. So I feel like whatever happens in the image processing world will happen. It doesn't really have anything to do with me. Artists don't have much power in relationship to that, except to make the images we can. So I don't think that my work is really of much value to people who are concerned about that directly.
Thank you so much. We would, of course, like to open up the conversation to our audience. And I think Matilda has a microphone over here. And I think we have a question here in the front. Matilda? Thank you. Over here.
I think it was quite telling that you started your speech with a painting by Velázquez, Las Meninas. And this painting is very famous for its riddles, for its questions that the spectator might ask in front of this painting. And maybe there's a parallel between your art, your photographs, which are full of allusions to referring to art in special. And the spectator might ask himself, he might ask questions. So I see a parallel between this painting you showed us first and what you are doing.
I'm very happy you see it. Very happy you see it that way. I think that's just I think that let's call it ambiguity, which is a sort of a generic term meaning the effect that works of art have on us. That they do make it difficult for us to have a settled response to them, and we enjoy that. To me, that is the gap between the writing that gets erased by me or any artist and the writing that is reinstituted by the person looking at it. Velázquez's painting is, as I said, the exemplar of what painting can do. I use it as an example because of all single paintings one can put on a screen, it's the one that stands for and embodies those qualities. So I don't cultivate ambiguity. I don't believe that ambiguity can be cultivated as a value or achievement. I think that is the result of the making processes that one goes through in making whatever you're making, whether it's writing or composing music or making pictures. The work process itself is the drama. I know that the emotion in my pictures isn't mine, except insofar as it might reflect the feelings that went on during the making of the picture. So that is a paradox, because the woman who's fallen from her horse would have feelings, and I guess we would be interested in them in a narrative dimension, that there's some narrative dimension to her experience. You know, the chagrin of having fallen from your expensive horse, your super expensive saddle, and all your beautiful accoutrements, and there you are on the ground. You know, there's a certain almost comic element to the fact of this reversal of fortune of somebody who's not necessarily interested in having their fortunes reversed. So that is a
We're not talking about the horse. So.
I don't take sides. But the point is that ambiguity is not my ambiguity. It's the ambiguity that emerges from the condition itself. And what any artist does, and it's what I tried to do, is make that image enjoyable for its color, its forms, its, you know, its light, etc., the rhythms in it, all of that, all those formal things. That's what I think artists, when they're doing their best, is what they do. They deal with the fundamental things and make it work. In that sense, you never get out of art class number one. You're always in art class number one, which is the fundamental things. And those things, when they get set in motion by the things I've tried to tell you about, they disclose the complexity, let's call it, of the world itself. And that complexity is beyond my comprehension and yours. And the fact that it is beyond our comprehension has that, you know, that sort of Kantian sense of the exhilaration of understanding knowledge where there's no knowledge, that you feel like you know something cosmic, but in fact there's no content. Well, there is content, but it's not knowable directly. So, but I don't think that's a personal achievement. I think it's really rooted in your relationship to the work process. And that's why I like this fusion aspect of photography, because it opened up, for me at least, a working process, very plastic, very open to different things. That's why I think that what I do is pure photography, just as much as Walker Evans is pure photography. I know I'm rambling, but I'll just make this point because I think it's kind of important. The instantaneous capture that reportage achieved and was the original founding distinction of photography is still the fundamental and founding distinction of photography. Nothing I've ever done or anyone else has or will disturb that fact. Photography is essentially about this automatic capture and what it can do. But that isn't its entire artistic dimension. As soon as you put a camera in a place, other things open up. So without ever disturbing the notion of the essential nature of photography, and I don't think anything I've done or any other photographer's done in terms of artifice or all this stuff has disturbed any of that, that photography is such an incalculably complex medium that we still don't really know it. So there's no reason why what I do isn't as close to the essence of photography as anyone else's.
In the interest of time, perhaps one last question. I know we could go on forever. It's just such a delight listening to you. But perhaps we have time for one last question. Maybe we've said everything. Or you've said everything. Thank you so much, Jeff. It was truly fantastic.